Forget Hannibal's elephants crossing the Alps, or Spartacus and his army of slaves shaking the empire to its core. Instead, imagine Roman legions marching into a strange, almost surreal battle one, where their enemy wasn't a human army at all, but massive armored creatures from the sea. This is the bizarre legend of Romans fighting giant crabs. Misunderstanding and genuine historical confusion can twist the image of Rome's endless wars. Was this an exaggeration passed down through unreliable sources, or could there have been some kernel of truth hidden within the strangest of battle tales? Picture a Roman legion. These were men hardened by years of discipline and war. They had faced terrifying enemies before towering Germanic warriors in the dense forests of the north, the deadly arrows of Parthian horsemen in the east, and the constant threat of ambush in the rough mountains of Britannia. They were prepared for human foes, not monsters. Yet, the accounts that trickled into Roman history suggest that in certain coastal campaigns, rumors spread of strange battles fought not against men, but against sea creatures that seemed too big to be real. At first glance, it's easy to dismiss. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, Roman natural historians like Pliny the Elder wrote of giant serpents and massive fish that could sink ships. In that context, giant crabs don't sound so fetched. If sailors told stories of enormous sea beasts, why wouldn't Roman soldiers encountering something strange in unfamiliar waters have their encounters warped into a tale of monstrous crabs? But here's the strange part. This wasn't a one-off rumor. The idea of giant crabs appears in scattered legends across different regions of the empire. Some sources hint at coastal expeditions in North Africa, where soldiers came across oversized crustaceans while securing shorelines. Others place the legend in Greece, tying it back to older myths, where creatures from the sea often appeared as divine punishments. Imagine Roman soldiers, grounded in their strict military discipline, suddenly thrown into chaos when faced with creatures they couldn't categorize. A soldier might write home describing a skirmish on the beach, only for the tale to grow in the telling until the enemy became not bandits or wildlife, but monstrous armored crabs. Let's pause for a moment and think about what could have inspired this. Crabs can grow to enormous sizes in reality. The Japanese spider crab, for example, can reach a span of over 12 feet. Of course, the Romans never encountered these creatures in their waters, but other large crabs existed in the Mediterranean and along the African coasts. To an unprepared legionary, fighting a cluster of them at night with torches and spears might have seemed like facing some alien army. Now imagine the chaos of such an encounter. Shields clattering, men shouting in confusion as creatures with snapping claws rushed across the sand. A small scuffle retold around campfires could easily transform into the tale of a full-scale battle against monstrous crabs. The Romans also had a tendency to weave myth into their history. In Greek mythology, Heracles faced a giant crab during his battle with the Hydra. The crab bit at his feet as he fought, and for its service, the gods placed it among the stars as the constellation Cancer. The Romans absorbed Greek myths into their own culture. So when soldiers or writers described strange creatures in battle, it wasn't just a report of natural events, it became a continuation of myth, a blending of history and legend. A small group of oversized crabs on a beach might not have been dramatic enough, but reframe it through the lens of myth. And suddenly, it's another epic struggle between men and monsters. Consider also the role of propaganda. Roman generals often exaggerated their victories to enhance their reputations. If a commander wanted to add flair to a mundane coastal skirmish, why not claim he fought and defeated monstrous sea beasts? It turned an otherwise unremarkable encounter into something worthy of celebration. Soldiers returning from such campaigns might play along, embellishing the tale for audiences eager for stories of Roman valor against strange and terrifying foes. To a population accustomed to hearing of gladiators fighting exotic animals in the arena, the idea of soldiers fighting giant crabs wouldn't. Seemed that strange it would sound like another example of Roman bravery against nature itself. But let's not lose sight of the human side of this. Imagine being one of those soldiers. You're far from home, on foreign shores, and you encounter something strange in the dark waves. A claw the size of your arm snaps out of the surf, grabbing at your shield. Your spear thrust glances off a hard shell. The creature doesn't fight like a man. It doesn't retreat when wounded. It scuttles sideways, armored, relentless. To the men beside you, Already nervous from strange surroundings, that single encounter becomes terrifying. By the next morning, when the story spreads, it's no longer just one creature it's a horde, and by the time it reaches Rome, it's a full-scale battle against monstrous crabs. This is how history and myth tangle together. What begins as a simple skirmish with oversized sea life becomes a tale of Roman legions fighting monsters. These legends endure not because they are literally true, but because they capture something essential about how humans process fear and the unknown. Soldiers facing strange creatures could only explain them in the language they knew: myth, monsters, and battles. For the Romans, whose empire stretched into lands they barely understood, this kind of storytelling bridged the gap between reality and the inexplicable. What makes this legend fascinating is not whether it literally happened, but what it says about the Roman world. It shows us how myths seeped into daily life, how propaganda shaped even the strangest encounters, and how soldiers' experiences on the edge of the empire could become stories that still intrigue us today. The battles with giant crabs may never have been fought, but they remind us of the blurry line between history and legend, between fact and the strange tales whispered by men around a campfire. And that's why this story still matters. It forces us to question what we take for granted about the past. Was every account of Roman conquest precise fact? Or were there always layers of exaggeration, myth, and misunderstanding? The truth is probably somewhere in between. But one thing is certain: history is far stranger than we often imagine. If you've enjoyed diving into this strange legend of Rome's supposed battles with giant crabs, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. This is just the first part of the journey into one of history's strangest battlefield myths, and you won't want to miss what comes next. When we peel back the layers of legend and look at the scraps of evidence left behind, one name immediately rises to the surface: Pliny the Elder, known for his vast compilation of knowledge in natural history. Pliny documented everything from astronomy to animals, blending careful observation with rumor, myth, and secondhand reports. Tucked away within these writings is a passing reference to giant crabs, creatures so massive that Roman soldiers, the most disciplined infantry in the ancient world, reportedly found their formations disrupted by them. This is the seed of the story, the one line that suggests Rome may have fought something altogether stranger than man. To understand the weight of Pliny's claim, it helps to picture a Roman legion in Asia Minor. These legions were drilled to perfection. Every soldier knew his place in the formation, every shield locked in line, every thrust of the gladius precise and calculated. The phalanx-like discipline of Roman infantry was their greatest strength. Nothing neither barbarian charges nor cavalry surges could easily break their wall of shields. Yet here was Pliny suggesting that crabs, of all things, had managed to do just that. The image is both comical and unsettling. Armored men, whose reputations for discipline terrified the world, struggling against oversized crustaceans crawling through their ranks. Now, Pliny doesn't linger on this story. He drops it in almost casually, as if it were one oddity among many. That raises questions. Did he intend it as literal fact, or was it hearsay passed along from a sailor or soldier who exaggerated an encounter with local wildlife? Pliny had a habit of blending credible reports with outrageous ones. For example, he wrote about giant serpents capable of swallowing entire animals, and about tribes of people with strange physical features that modern science has never confirmed. His natural history is part encyclopedia, part folklore, and part catalog of the bizarre. The crab story falls right into that middle ground, where fact and myth blur. But what would it mean for crabs to disrupt a Roman formation? Let's explore this with a more grounded lens. In coastal Asia Minor, especially along the Aegean and Mediterranean, large crabs are not unheard of. While not the size of houses, some species could reach several feet across. To soldiers unfamiliar with local wildlife, particularly those marching near tidal flats or rocky shores, encounters with unusually large crabs might have caused alarm. Picture a group of legionaries setting up camp by the coast, only to be swarmed at night by dozens of massive crabs scavenging for food. The creatures could have moved directly into the soldiers' tents, snapping at supplies, biting at legs, and generally causing chaos. In the dark, with fear and exaggeration at play, the encounter could easily have been remembered as a battle rather than a nuisance. Yet Pliny's account goes further. It frames the creatures as interfering with infantry formations. That wording suggests not just a few crabs scavenging, but a disruption significant enough to challenge the structured order of the Roman military machine. Here is where we might see the myth-making process in action. A small-scale encounter, retold among soldiers and later recorded by writers, grows in scale with each retelling. Instead of 5 or 6 oversized crabs snapping at boots and shields, it becomes a horde of monsters that force the mighty legion into disarray. The cultural backdrop is important here too. Romans inherited much of their myth-making from the Greeks, and the Greeks had no shortage of monstrous sea creatures in their legends. The crab that attacked Heracles during his battle with the Hydra was immortalized in the stars as the constellation Cancer. In Greek thought, the sea was a place of chaos and danger, filled with divine punishments and monstrous life forms. Romans, who respected and absorbed Greek traditions, often recycled these motifs into their own stories. So when Pliny or another writer mentions giant crabs, the image immediately connects to those older myths, lending the tale a mythological weight that simple, oversized crabs would not have carried. It's also worth considering the role of storytelling among soldiers. A Roman legionary on campaign often lived a hard, monotonous, lifelong marches, endless camp duties, and bursts of terrifying combat. Around the campfire, stories grew in the telling. A crab that pinched a soldier's ankle might be retold as a crab that broke a spear. By the time the story reached Rome, passed through scribes and scholars. It was transformed into an event where monstrous crabs broke entire formations. Pliny, collecting these stories, didn't necessarily care about separating truth from embellishment. His job was to record the breadth of human knowledge and rumor, to preserve even the most outlandish tales. If we place ourselves in the moment, we can imagine how confusing it must have been. Roman formations relied on stability and predictability. An enemy army behaved in ways soldiers were trained to countercharging, retreating, flanking. But animals, they fought unpredictably, ignoring lines of discipline and striking where soldiers least expected it. That's part of why wild animal hunts, the Venatians in Roman amphitheaters, were so popular. They offered chaos against order, wildness against civilization. 2 Roman soldiers in Asia Minor, encountering giant crabs, might have felt like a surreal living version of these staged hunts. Only this time, there was no audience cheering them on, just confusion, fear, and the realization that nature didn't care about Rome's rigid discipline. There's also the possibility of mistranslation or misinterpretation. Pliny worked with secondhand reports, many of them filtered through traders, travelers, and soldiers speaking different languages. A word describing a large sea creature could easily have been rendered as crab in Latin, even if it referred to something else entirely. Perhaps the soldiers faced large lobsters, giant sea turtles, or even a mass of other marine life. Over time, the description hardened into crabs, and the absurdity of the image is what kept it alive in memory. This is where the story becomes more than just a curiosity. It highlights how fragile our grasp of ancient history can be. We rely on sources like Pliny, knowing they are flawed, yet they are sometimes all we have. His casual mention of giant crabs leaves us wondering. Was it a myth dressed as fact, an exaggeration of a real event, or a misunderstood report of something more ordinary? We may never know the exact truth, but we can see clearly how myth and reality collided in the Roman world. Soldiers fought not only human enemies, but also the strange, the unexplained, and the exaggerated tales that turned small encounters into legendary battles. For modern readers, the story of Romans fighting giant crabs may sound absurd, even laughable, yet within it lies something deeply human: the way fear, misunderstanding, and storytelling transform reality. Whether the Romans actually faced crabs large enough to disrupt their formations is less important than what the story tells us about them. It shows their vulnerability, their need to explain the unknown, and their tendency to merge reality with myth. And that, in its own way, makes the tale of the giant crabs just as revealing as any account of Rome's more conventional wars. This is the strange beauty of digging into history's odd corners. Even the smallest mention in an ancient text can open a window into how people saw their world, sometimes terrifying, sometimes exaggerated, but always revealing. And in this case, it reveals a Rome that was not just conquering foreign lands, but also grappling with stories of monsters scuttling through the cracks of their history. When we stop and take a harder look at this strange story of Romans facing giant crabs, it is important to remember who told it and what his purpose was. Pliny the Elder, for all his fame as a naturalist, was never simply a scientist in the modern sense. His natural history was a massive encyclopedia that tried to cover everything known or rumored about the world. In that mix, you find accounts that feel reliable, such as descriptions of plants and minerals, right alongside stories of fantastical beasts, impossible tribes of men, and natural wonders that defy reason. The giant crab story sits within that broader habit of blending fact with exaggeration, science with myth. One way to understand how this might have happened is to consider how knowledge traveled in the ancient world. Roman soldiers, merchants, and sailors often returned from foreign campaigns or long voyages with stories of unusual creatures. Sometimes these were accurate, but inflated in scale, like crocodiles in the Nile being described as monsters large enough to swallow ships. Other times, they came from misunderstandings, where local descriptions of animals were mistranslated or reshaped into forms that fit existing myths. Pliny, who gathered information from hundreds of earlier sources, rarely filtered the outlandish stories. Instead, he preserved them. His approach was that even strange or doubtful reports deserved to be recorded, because they represented part of humanity's collective memory. The result is that his natural history is filled with creatures that blur the line between natural observation and legend. So when Pliny briefly mentions crabs so large they disrupted Roman formations, there are several possible explanations. The simplest is exaggeration. Crabs, after all, can grow to impressive sizes in the right environments. Consider the coconut crab, a massive land-dwelling species found in the Indo-Pacific, which can reach over 3 feet across and has claws strong enough to crack open coconuts. Imagine a legionary unfamiliar with such a creature, encountering one in the wild. To him, it would have seemed monstrous, alien, and almost supernatural. If several appeared at once, perhaps scavenging food stores at night or clattering across rocky ground, the event could easily be described as an attack. By the time it was retold, the crabs had become not only large, but large enough to threaten military formations. What began as a small nuisance could quickly grow into the stuff of legend. Another explanation is misidentification. Ancient writers often confuse different species of animals, particularly when describing creatures outside their own homelands. A Roman soldier might have seen a giant lobster, a turtle, or even a sea creature washed ashore and described it as a crab because that was the closest familiar word. Pliny, working from second-hand accounts, might have simply accepted the term without realizing that what was described wasn't technically a crab at all. This kind of error was common. Herodotus, centuries before, had written about gold-digging ants in India, which most modern scholars believe were actually marmots disturbed by mining activity. The language barrier and the lack of precision in natural science at the time meant that strange animals often became distorted as they traveled into written history. There's also the possibility that the giant crab story wasn't literal at all, but metaphorical. In ancient literature, metaphors were often used to make sense of strange or difficult experiences. A rough coastal terrain filled with jagged rocks could be described metaphorically as fighting crabs that pinched and disrupted the formation. Roman soldiers, struggling to advance through such terrain, may have told the story in that symbolic way, only for later writers like Pliny to take it literally. This would not be unusual in ancient sources often blurred metaphor with reality, especially when it came to exotic lands and distant campaigns. To see how this fits into a broader pattern, we only need to look at some of the other strange claims in ancient texts. Writers described entire tribes of one-eyed men, people with dog heads, or races that had feet so large they could be used as umbrellas. Clearly, no one ever saw such creatures in reality. Instead, these stories reflected the ancient world's tendency to fill gaps in knowledge with imagination. When people encountered something strange but not fully understood, they reached for mythic comparisons. In this sense, giant crabs join a long list of anomalies that reveal more about ancient storytelling than about the natural world. But why crabs specifically? Crabs are naturally alien-looking to humans. They scuttle sideways, their eyes sit on stalks, and their pincers are strong enough to wound. To people who were used to fighting human enemies, the idea of fighting a creature that moved unpredictably, struck from odd angles, and could crush weapons or limbs was terrifying. Even a normal-sized crab swarm could feel overwhelming to a soldier unused to such animals. Amplify that with exaggeration, and the story becomes one of monstrous crabs disrupting entire legions. The absurdity doesn't erase the fear that might have been very real in the moment. This blending of fear, misunderstanding, and exaggeration is what makes stories like these last. They act as cultural mirrors, reflecting both the limits of ancient knowledge and the human tendency to fill those gaps with narrative. For a Roman audience, hearing that soldiers had faced giant crabs would not have seemed as ridiculous as it might to us today. Instead, it would have fit into their worldview, where the edges of the known world were populated by strange beasts and uncanny landscapes. It would have reinforced the idea that Rome was constantly pushing against the boundaries of the familiar, conquering not just men, but the very monsters of the earth. To make this even clearer, consider a scenario. A Roman legion marches along the coast of Asia Minor, setting up camp near rocky shores. At night, crabs emerge in large numbers, drawn by food scraps left in camp. Soldiers awake to clattering sounds, see shadows moving, and panic spreads as men are bitten or startled. In the darkness, with fear magnifying everything, the crabs seem enormous, relentless, and hostile. The soldiers drive them off, but the story has already grown in their minds. By the time they return home, the tale is retold with embellishments. The crabs weren't just big, they were massive, monstrous, enough to threaten a formation. Pliny, collecting the story later, records it without questioning. The result is the legend we're analyzing now. What stands out here is not whether giant crabs truly existed, but how stories evolve and survive. The anomaly is less about biology and more about human perception. A real encounter mundane, exaggerated, or misunderstood morphed into a piece of lore that still captures our attention. By comparing it to other strange claims in ancient texts, we see that the Romans were not unique in this. Every culture, when faced with the unknown, shaped its fears and experiences into stories that blended fact with myth. The Romans, for all their discipline and power, were no different. They too created monsters out of mystery. In this way, the so-called giant crabs remind us that history is never just a record of what happened. It is also a record of how people interpreted what happened, how they shaped their experiences into tales that made sense to them, and how those tales in turn shaped the worldview of generations. Whether metaphor, exaggeration, or misidentification, the anomaly of the giant crabs offers a window into the Roman imagination, a place where a line between reality and legend was always shifting, always alive, and always ready to turn the ordinary into the extraordinary. If there is one trait that defined the Roman legions above all others, it was their ability to adapt. Discipline and ingenuity were their greatest weapons, often more decisive than swords or shields. Whether they were marching into the forests of Germania, crossing rivers in Britannia, or building siege works around a walled city, the Romans had a remarkable capacity to adjust their methods when confronted with strange or overwhelming challenges. The legend of giant crabs, whether literal or symbolic, fits neatly into this larger pattern. Even if such an adversary were real, the Roman response would not have been panic, it would have been problem-solving. The Roman army was not a mob of fighters, but a carefully engineered machine. Every soldier was trained not only to fight, but also to think in terms of formations, structures, and group survival. When a legion faced something unusual, commanders relied on the cohesion of the men and the flexibility of their system. If a massive creature war, even just a swarm of ordinary but frighteningly large animals, threatened their ranks, their instinct would have been to use discipline to hold firm. The testudo, or tortoise formation, is the best example, by locking their shields overhead and on all sides. The legionaries created a shell that could withstand projectiles, sudden charges, or anything that attempted to break their line. In theory, even giant claws snapping against their shields would find no easy target. For the Romans, the formation was less about brute strength and more about psychological resilience. Soldiers under that protective shell knew they were part of something greater, and that unity gave them the courage to face the unknown. Engineering was another powerful tool at their disposal. The Roman military was as much a construction crew as it was a fighting force. Soldiers carried tools for digging ditches, building palisades, and crafting siege engines. If confronted with an unusual threat, the legion could quickly alter the environment to its advantage. In the case of giant crabs, one can easily imagine them digging traps, building barriers, or even using fire to drive the creatures away. Romans were pragmatic. Above all else, They were not interested in proving bravery against monsters, but in neutralizing the danger as efficiently as possible. If the enemy was human, that meant flanking maneuvers or cavalry charges. If the enemy was a strange creature, that meant using the terrain, tools, and group tactics to nullify the threat. A useful comparison comes from their campaigns in Britain. When the Romans encountered war chariots used by local tribes, they had no precedent for such a weapon in their recent history. The sight of fast-moving vehicles with warriors hurling javelins could have thrown lesser armies into chaos, but the legions adapted. They studied the patterns of attack, learned when the chariots were most vulnerable, and developed counters. In time, the shock value wore off, and the chariot became a manageable, if still dangerous, threat. The same mindset applies to the story of giant crabs. Even if the creatures existed, the Romans would have turned the unfamiliar into something familiar by breaking it down into tactical problems. How do these creatures move? Where are they weakest? What tools or formations can protect the men until the danger is contained? One could also imagine the Romans applying their famous use of projectiles. Every legionary carried a heavy throwing spear designed to pierce armor and shields. Against a large animal, this weapon would be devastating. The Romans knew how to throw in unison, creating a rain of spears that could halt a cavalry charge or shatter an enemy shield wall. If a crab the size of a man or larger lurched toward them, the coordinated strike of pila could cripple it before it reached the line. After that, short swords or gladi would finish the job. Unlike chaotic mobs of warriors, the Romans fought as a machine, each man covering the other. Even a monstrous adversary would find itself caught in a system designed to grind down anything in its path. Their adaptability also extended to psychological warfare. The Romans understood morale as a weapon. They used horns, banners, and disciplined movement to intimidate enemies. Against strange beasts, they could have employed fire, loud noise, or massed formations to create an overwhelming display of force. Animals, unlike humans, had no loyalty or cause to die for. They responded to fear, noise, and danger. The Romans, trained to amplify their presence, would have quickly learned to use their discipline to frighten the creatures as much as to fight them. What makes this story even more fascinating is how it highlights the difference between Roman soldiers and other groups of the ancient world. Many armies, when confronted with something bizarre, might have panicked or fled. Superstition was common in antiquity, and strange creatures were often seen as omens or divine punishments. But the Roman army, while certainly not immune to superstition, had a culture of practicality. They worshipped their gods and read omens, but on the battlefield, they trusted in their training. Even if men whispered that the giant crabs were signs from Neptune or curses from foreign lands, the commanders would have treated them as just another obstacle. That balance between belief and pragmatism was part of Rome's military genius. To see Roman ingenuity at work, one might also think of their naval battles. When the Romans first fought Carthage, they were inexperienced at sea. The Carthaginians were seasoned sailors, and Rome's fleets could not match their maneuvering. But instead of accepting defeat, the Romans invented the corvus, a boarding device that turned naval battles into land battles fought on decks. They transformed an arena of weakness into one of strength. The same inventive spirit could apply to strange land encounters. A giant crab, no matter how bizarre, would be treated as a tactical problem waiting for a practical solution. It is worth imagining a scene where this played out. A Roman cohort marches along the coast, only to be startled by the sudden appearance of massive crabs scuttling across their path. The first reaction might be confusion, even fear. But a centurion's whistle cuts through the noise. The men fall into formation. Shields, lock, and pila are raised. The crabs strike the shield wall, their claws scraping against wood and iron, but the formation holds the centurion's signal. A volley of spears arcs through the air, striking the creatures. The men advance methodically, step by step, pushing the enemy back. What began as chaos turns into order. The Romans, by sheer discipline, absorb the strangeness of the encounter and turn it into victory. Whether this event happened or not, the legend captures something real about Roman military culture. They were not invincible, but they were relentless in finding solutions. For them, every battle was a puzzle. Enemy chariots, elephants, fortresses, or even the supposed monsters of distant lands, each demanded adaptation. That is why Rome endured for centuries, not because their enemies were weak, but because the Romans never allowed the unknown to overwhelm them for long. The tale of giant crabs may be fantastical, but it illustrates perfectly the mindset that made the legions so formidable: discipline, ingenuity, and the refusal to surrender to fear. Roman military history is often remembered for its victories over men and armies, defeated, rebellions crushed, and vast territories brought under the eagle's standards. But when we step into the stranger corners of ancient accounts, we find stories that challenge our understanding of what those soldiers faced. The mention of giant crabs, odd as it sounds, pushes us to imagine life as a Roman soldier, not as a straight line of glorious campaigns, but as an existence full of the unexpected. It reminds us that the Roman experience of the world was far broader, stranger, and more mysterious than the polished marble statues and triumphant arches we usually associate with their empire. Think about what this story says about the Roman army beyond just its discipline and battlefield success. A legionary's life was never predictable. He could be marching in the sweltering heat of Syria one year, trudging through the forests of Germania the next, and standing on some windswept shoreline facing an enemy no training manual could prepare him for. For many soldiers, the world was larger and stranger than the towns and villages they came from. They saw landscapes that felt alien, animals they had never heard of, and cultures with customs that were completely different from their own. To hear rumors of monstrous creatures in distant provinces was not unusual. It was part of the tapestry of the ancient imagination. For the men living through it, the boundaries between myth and reality often blurred. If a Roman soldier returned home and told his family he had seen giant crabs that disrupted entire formations, who could say with certainty it was false? After all, Rome's expansion constantly brought back tales of elephants, rhinoceroses, giraffes, and other exotic creatures that had once seemed mythical. In fact, some Romans believed elephants to be unnatural monsters until they saw them deployed on battlefields by Pyrrhus and Hannibal. What seems bizarre to us might have seemed plausible, or at least not impossible, to them. The giant crab story, whether exaggerated or metaphorical, reflected the sense that Rome was marching into a world where anything could be waiting. The endurance of the Roman army was not only physical, but mental. They had to accept that their duty took them into unknown dangers. One day they could face enemy spears, the next a flood, a plague, or the terror of beasts that clawed at the edges of human imagination. Ancient life did not draw clear lines between natural and supernatural the way we often do today. A soldier might believe in omens, divine punishment, or mythical beasts, yet still fight bravely against whatever stood before him. This duality, faith in the gods and trust in his training, helped him survive the chaos of his world. The story of the giant crabs captures that balance. The men might have whispered about Neptune sending monstrous creatures from the sea, but they would still lock shields and advance as their officers commanded. It also paints a picture of the kind of stories that bound soldiers together. Armies thrive on shared experience, and tales of bizarre encounters, whether true or embellished, became part of their collective identity. Around campfires at night, soldiers would retell battles, sometimes adding strange flourishes to make sense of what they saw, or to make the hardship more memorable. A story of giant crabs tearing into formations could serve as a warning, a joke, or even a badge of pride. We survived what others would never believe. Such stories connected them to the broader mystery of the world they were conquering. Looking at this tale through the lens of history also forces us to question what we think we know about the Roman Empire. Our image of Rome often comes from polished accounts, monumental inscriptions, and carefully written histories designed to glorify the state. But beneath those official stories lay a world full of superstition, rumor, and strange encounters. When we peel back the layers, Rome looks less like a flawless machine of conquest and more like a human project, full of confusion, wonder, and improvisation. The giant crab anecdote is valuable, not because it proves anything about zoology, but because it opens a window into how Romans made sense of their encounters with the unknown. It also highlights something deeper. Rome's empire was not only a contest of swords and shields, but also a psychological struggle to dominate the unknown. The legions were not just conquering lands, but facing nature, superstition, and fear. To endure, they had to carry with them a worldview that could withstand encounters that defied logic. Whether the adversary was a barbarian tribe, a wild animal, or even a legendary sea creature, the Romans prided themselves on being ready for anything. This mindset, more than their weapons, was what made them so formidable. We may never know what Pliny the Elder truly meant when he wrote about crabs large enough to trouble Roman legions. Perhaps it was a metaphor for difficult terrain. Perhaps it was an exaggerated tale of large land crabs encountered near the coastlines of Asia Minor. Or perhaps it was simply one of those ancient embellishments meant to entertain as much as to inform, but also a collection of mysteries, half-truths, and strange whispers that reveal the mindset of those who lived it. In the end, the tale of Romans battling giant crabs goes beyond curiosity. It invites us to imagine their world in a richer way. A soldier of Rome was not only a cog in a war machine, he was a man living in an unpredictable universe, facing dangers both ordinary and extraordinary. His courage was measured not only in his willingness to fight men, but in his ability to march into a world full of shadows, myths, and the constant threat of the unknown. That is what makes this strange story so powerful. If you've enjoyed diving into this strange corner of Roman history, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. There are countless more forgotten, bizarre, and unexpected stories waiting to be uncovered.